This is my second video for Sartre's introductory chapter to Being and Nothingness, the Pursuit of Being. In this introductory chapter, Sartre sets up the concept of the in itself and briefly introduces the for itself. The relation between these two concepts, these two conceptions of being, directs the inquiry of the entire study to come. Now, in every chapter, Sartre will in one way or another reformulate the same description of human consciousness in a predicament where the transcendent individual, the self-conscious individual, is locked outside of himself or herself. That as individuals we are alone in the privacy of our mind, alone with our point of view. And so as this crops up over and over again, as we advance through the book, we will augment our understanding of it. As human beings, we could conceive of ourselves as an in itself, but we cannot ever apprehend our being in itself. We cannot ever grasp ourselves as an object. We cannot ever grasp ourselves as a definite totality. This is what it would mean to apprehend ourselves as an object. Because we are always transcending the absolute terms of the in itself by means of the for itself. We feel at a fundamental level that we must exist as something definite, but we can never seize a definite understanding of ourselves because we are always a work in progress. We are always being pulled from the future towards our being, the being we have to be. We define ourselves by the being we have yet to become. This dynamic of the human being, of self-conscious, transcendent beings, is central to being and nothingness, and the predicament between these two conceptions of being unfolds into every dimension of our life. Our sexuality, our pride, our shame, our capacity for love, our inclinations towards sadism and cruelty, all of this unfolds from the relation between the in itself and the for itself, and it unfolds over the course of this book. So I'd like to discuss a few of his terms and conceptions that emerge early on. In one sense, these early chapters can be more challenging than later chapters because we are encountering for the first time a number of ideas that are repeated in different contexts later in the book. So as the concepts of the in itself and the for itself are referred to over and over again in different formulations in later chapters, we develop a better sense of them. Rather early on in this introductory chapter, Sartre introduces a distinction between the reflective consciousness and the unreflective consciousness. He uses an example of counting cigarettes, which is an activity that, to put into common sense terms, is a mindless task, something you hardly know you were doing. But when asked while doing it, you could respond that I'm counting cigarettes. So Sartre is pointing out this dynamic of consciousness and refers to it as the unreflective consciousness versus the reflective consciousness, or non-thetic as opposed to thetic consciousness. He then measures this against Descartes' cogito and demonstrates that the certainty of being for a self-conscious individual exists prior to reflection. It is included with the initial upsurge of consciousness. Sartre is not reflecting on the activity of counting while he's doing it, but when asked, he brings the foundational awareness to a higher plane of reflection. This foundational awareness will be referred to as the pre-reflective cogito for the duration of the book. Sartre writes, "It is the non-reflective consciousness which renders the reflection possible. There is a pre-reflective cogito which is the condition of the Cartesian cogito." Now, when Sartre refers to a single stroke of consciousness or a single upsurge of consciousness, he's referring to how consciousness is always of something. This concept follows Husserl's concept of noesis, and it holds that consciousness is intentional. It's a package deal. The spontaneity of our existence may come in the form of an action, accompanied with a sense of positionality, a sense of time, all in a single upsurge, and this awareness has an intention to it, a specificity that is suited to the ends we direct ourselves to. Sartre writes that consciousness is consciousness of something. This means that transcendence is the constitutive structure of consciousness. That is, that consciousness is born supported by a being which is not itself. In other words, consciousness is directed at something out in the world, and it is instantiated by that something. So if we are to explain consciousness by what a transcendent being is conscious of, then what about consciousness itself? What is consciousness other than what it is directed on? It is nothing in one sense because it is supported by everything outside of it. In later chapters, Sartre will refer to this as a whole in being, but we don't need to get too far into that now. Now, there are a number of different terms which may refer to what is outside of us, things and appearances that are both out in the world and in our perception. This is a tricky dilemma for Sartre to navigate because, as a phenomenological study, Sartre is assessing the appearance of things. So we are discussing the outside world as it manifests through our perceptive apparatus. So Sartre has to be able to refer to things as they are in themselves and as they are in our perception. You will notice that Sartre may refer to an existent, an object, a phenomenon, the appearance, the essence, as well as being in itself. These concepts span each other and often coincide in what they refer to. They are not necessarily distinguished by the identity of the existent they refer to, but rather they are distinguished by the context they are addressed through. For example, when Sartre refers to an existent, he is referring to something in the world without having to implicate it as something perceived. He is using the word existent to refer us to reality independently of consciousness. He is referring to it prior to its manifestation as an appearance. It is simply there in the world, awaiting differentiation from a transcendent point of view, from a subject, from a for itself. We do not apprehend the essence of the existent, nor is the essence of the existent hidden away behind its appearance. The essence of an existent is conferred onto it by human reality. Any given existent can be perceived in different ways from which the meaning or essence becomes disclosed to us through. For example, the hammer is illuminated by its use in hammering the nail. Its meaning, its essence as a hammer, is the meaning of the object. Essence does not reside in the object. Its meaning, its essence, is conferred on it by human transcendence. A hammer can be perceived as a paperweight if there is a breeze. As Sartre writes, the object does not hide being, but neither does it reveal being. When we apprehend the hammer as a hammer, we are not apprehending it in itself. The hammer exists as a being in itself. It is inert matter. But that is not what we know when we know it as an object. Rather, what is illuminated to us is its essence, which is its use to us as a hammer, or as a paperweight, if need be. Human reality makes the hammer a hammer. Another term that needs clarification in this context is transcendence. Transcendence is not to be understood in its common notion as part of a spiritual breakthrough into a higher order of things. That's not quite how the term is being used here, although this common notion is compatible with how Sartre uses the word. In this first chapter, Sartre is laying out what will later be described as human reality. Insofar as we see a future possibility to fasten two pieces of wood together, we transcend being in itself towards the hammer. We transcend its being as inert matter towards its meaning, which is its use, its essence. It becomes a hammer because our consciousness surpasses it as merely inert matter to realize it through its function, thereby conferring its essence onto it. It is therefore an existent before it is a hammer. It is an existent before it is an object. It arises within the purity and totality of the appearance to be differentiated from other objects, and the appearance is disclosed to us through the pre-reflective cogito. The world around us is illuminated by the projects which organize our perception of it. This idea will continually crop up in the chapters to come. Sartre is also introducing the phenomenon of being. The phenomenon of being could be something like boredom or nausea, to use Sartre's examples. They are examples of total states of mind, of being, from which the appearance of everything coincides with. The phenomenon is the objectification of the appearance. It is a totalizing description of a consciousness. So you can look at an existent in the state of boredom, anger, sadness, nausea. This phenomenon of being is projected with the appearance and is included in our objectification of it. In our boardroom, the hammer may become an object to play with as opposed to an object to use in a utilitarian sense. Now, when we refer to objects, we're referring to the basis of knowledge. This requires the subject, the transcendent point of view, in order to apprehend an object. Objects only exist to conscious subjects. So when Sartre mentions an object, there is also the implication of a subject. Now, the question we are dealing with here is, what is the reality of the object? Is the reality of the object its essence? As we already covered, no. The answer is no. The reality of the object is that it is there and that it is not me. This is our relation to the outside. There is an internal negation of the appearance. It is there and it is not me. But whatever it is we're referring to, it is your consciousness. And you are your consciousness. So the content of your consciousness must first be separated from you. And in order to do this, it must undergo an internal negation. It is there and it is not me. This also helps us understand what Sartre means when he refers to consciousness as positional. This internal negation situates our point of view as a body in the midst of the world. The totality of the infinite possible manifestations of an existent escapes us. Its reality in itself escapes us. And so the being of the object is non-being. We don't apprehend its reality in itself, rather we apprehend a phenomenon. We differentiate objects within the phenomenon according to the meaning placed upon it by human reality. We identify the table as opposed to a configuration of wood because we are looking to place a dish. Now, Sartre sets up his phenomenological project by pushing off Descartes. He introduces Descartes' cogito to modify it. I briefly introduced Descartes in the previous video. The distinction between Sartre's philosophy from Descartes', I think therefore I am, is that Sartre identifies an underlying presence of consciousness that is not reflected on, the pre-reflective consciousness as opposed to the reflective consciousness, as we already covered. Descartes' cogito is a reflection on consciousness. He is conscious of his own consciousness, and for Sartre, that is a step beyond what is necessary for the foundation of being. Consciousness is first pre-reflective. The phenomenon that appears to us is active on the non-reflective ground of consciousness. We are non-thetically conscious of the world around us. This is what it is immediately disclosed to us in the moment-to-moment rhythm of our lives. It is through reflection that we turn back on our own consciousness of an existent, objectify it to the level of knowledge. The certainty of existence precedes reflection, whereas Descartes reflects on his awareness of thought to conclude that his existence is certain. Sartre finishes his introduction by describing being in itself. This is non-conscious being. I briefly defined it early in this video. All that we could say of what being in itself is that it is. Sartre refers to being in itself as a plenitude. What he means by this is that its being is not supported by consciousness in the sense that the hammer is a hammer because it is perceived as such. The physical world around us exists independently from us as being in itself. One way of making better sense of this is demonstrating the dependence of knowledge on human reality, on nothingness, on the forward self. Knowledge depends on nothingness, because when we encounter a table, we can perceive it as a table through its utility, but we can also perceive it as the material it is made of, let's say wood. But what does that even mean? Wood is the stuff of trees. We're now perceiving the table as the stuff of trees. What is that? Ultimately, it's carbon. But in order to understand carbon, we have to have a scientific theory of matter. We need the periodic table of elements. And this exercise could continue infinitely. There is the dualism of the finite and the infinite here. We are always depending on human reality, on nothingness, to objectify the table, as either a table or as wood, as carbon, as fuel for a fire, whatever. Its being in itself escapes us always. All we can say of it is that it is. Our past is part of the in itself. When we die, we are only being in itself. There is no consciousness, there is no nothingness. The forward self is the opposite of the in itself. in that the forward self is our consciousness. It is transcendence. It's not a plenitude. It is a lack. It is the annihilation of our being in itself. This is how nothingness is introduced into the world. We are separated from what we are in definite terms. We are separated from what we are in itself. We are separated from the in itself that we are by the for itself. We are separated from the in itself that we are by the for itself, by the internal negation. Sartre elaborates on the for itself in part 2 of the book, but for now it helps to set up this relation. One quick note before I finish the video. It is very easy to confuse our notion of the conscious and the subconscious with the for itself and the in itself, and this is a mistake. The in itself is not your unconscious, it's not your subconscious. Sartre will critique Freud later in the book, and for now I just want to establish that because our Freudian notion of the subconscious and conscious, it's just so commonly used that it readily comes up when we're trying to make sense of Sartre's work as we read it for the first time. So that's enough for today. I know this is a bit confusing, so watch it a few times and know that the only way that you can make sense of anything that I just said is by actually reading the text. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel.